Man has always envied the bird, not just for its speed, but for its freedom. For centuries, we were bound to the ground and unable to fly, hover, or land where we pleased. But today, the dream of vertical flight, the vision of Leonardo da Vinci's helix, is finally a reality. We are witnessing the birth of a machine that defies the airplane's need for forward motion. This is the story of the helicopter, a triumph of engineering over the stubborn laws of physics. It began not with success, but with centuries of failure. Early pioneers realized that a propeller set horizontally could lift, but they lacked the power to turn it. Even when engines arrived, the machines were wild, unstable beasts that spun uncontrollably in the opposite direction of their rotors. It took the genius of men like Juan de la Cierva to realize that a rigid blade was the enemy. By allowing the blades to flap, to rise and fall like the wings of a gull, he tamed the unequal lift that threatened to flip these craft over. The autogyro was born a half-breed that could land short, but could not hover. It was a stepping stone, but the prize of true vertical takeoff remained just out of reach. Then came the breakthroughs. Breguet in France and Fokker in Germany proved it could be done. Hanna Reich stunned the world by flying the Fokker Achilles inside the Berlin Sports Stadium, a feat of control no airplane could match. Now, in the aftermath of the Great War, we see the explosion of innovation. We have the flying banana, a tandem rotor giant that looks like science fiction brought to life. We have the British Air Horse, a 3-rotor leviathan capable of lifting 8 tons, filling the gap between the light helicopter and the heavy transport plane. But innovation does not stop at heavy lifting. Look at the Little Henry, an American experiment where the rotors are driven by jets at the tips, eliminating the need for a tail rotor entirely. We see helicopters dusting crops, harvesting walnuts with their downwash, and carrying mail from city centres to remote villages. From the sleek Bristol 171 to the record-breaking Fairey Gyrodyne, the helicopter has arrived. It is no longer a toy of the eccentric inventor. It is the key to a future where the sky is open to all. In the last few years, a new dimension has been added to flying: vertical flight by helicopter. The very speed on which the aeroplane depends can sometimes be a handicap. Only a helicopter can hover. Only a helicopter could reach the storm-bound Wolf Rock Lighthouse. Vertical movement was man's first vision of flight. For centuries he tried to copy the free, controlled flight of birds and insects. He hadn't the eye of the slow-motion camera to follow the subtlety of wing movement of birds such as the hummingbird, but his attempts were brave enough. Not succeeding, he gave flight divinity and held it blasphemous to try to reach the stars. But men of vision, like Leonardo da Vinci, continued to search for means to fly. He experimented with flapping wings and whirling wings. It was also he who applied the word helix, meaning spiral, to whirling wings. Helix, combined with pteron, meaning wing, becomes helicopter. Leonardo da Vinci's whirling wing design was similar to the Chinese top, a toy whose origin is lost in early Chinese history. The top consists of a pair of wings at the head of a stick. About 2.5 centuries after Leonardo's death, the Englishman, Sir George Cayley, one of the fathers of aeronautics, developed a more elaborate top on similar lines. His interest had been roused by a model made by Lannoy and Bienvenu in France. The Lannoy and Bienvenu top consisted of two sets of wings which rotated in opposite directions. Its unusual flight caused a sensation when demonstrated before the Academy of Sciences at Paris. By now, men had learnt that if the blades of a wing or propeller are set level, they will only whirl when driven round. But if they are set at an angle and then driven round, the blades will produce lift. Cayley gave to the world the first plans for a man-carrying helicopter, the aerial carriage. His lead was followed by many others throughout the 19th century, but they all lacked a sufficiently light and powerful engine. At the end of the 19th century, men like Ponton d'Amicourt and Forlanini were trying to adapt steam engines to aircraft, but without success. Others, notably the Wright brothers, were working on fixed-wing aeroplanes. The petrol engine made possible man's first successful full-scale flight in 1903. Had the first successful flight been achieved with a rotary-wing helicopter, the history of flight might have been different. The achievement of the Wright brothers overshadowed all others and established the fixed-wing aircraft. But the moving wing still had its advocates. For the first 30 years of the century, they went on trying to make machines which would rise vertically into the air. In 1907, Breguet produced the first helicopter to leave the ground with a pilot aboard. The machine was unstable, but it did at least prove that the rotating wing aircraft was feasible. But all these early machines were unstable, and for safety, the aircraft had to be tethered to the ground. The stability of a rotary wing aircraft is particularly difficult. First, the rotation of the blades tends to make the body of the machine turn round in the opposite direction. This can be counteracted either by a small vertical tail rotor, driven by the same engine as the main rotor, or by two sets of main rotors revolving in opposite directions. Secondly, when the machine moves forward, one blade of the rotor is moving with the airflow, while another is moving against it. Therefore, when the aircraft is moving forward, the airspeed of a blade increases as it turns towards the nose. This produces unequal lift and therefore instability. The answer to this problem was to hinge the blades so that they could flap, and could also speed up or slow down relative to each other. Juan de la Cierva discovered this, and so managed to smooth out much of the irregularity of lift. This solves another problem. As the blades of the rotor are no longer rigidly fixed, they are held in position only by centrifugal force. The whole structure is therefore relieved of a great deal of strain. The Cierva aircraft, like this C-19, all used this principle of the flapping blade. But they were not helicopters. They were autogyros. In an autogyro, the machine is propelled by an air screw, and the rotor is turned by the aerodynamic forces acting on it, and not by the engine. The autogyro was in fact an aeroplane in which the wings are replaced by a rotor. The ordinary autogyro could not take off vertically, although its takeoff run was very short. In later years, vertical takeoff was achieved in the autogyro by coupling the engine to the rotor. This principle could be used only for the takeoff. Meanwhile, work on helicopters went on. In 1930, Florin showed his machine with the new flapping blade to the public at the Brussels exhibition. In the same year, D'Ascanio established the first world helicopter record with a flight of 8 3/4 minutes, covering 1,000 yards at a height of 59 feet. He reached a speed of about 15 miles an hour. 6 years later, in 1936, the pioneer Breguet came to the front with a much improved design, in which the problems of control were tackled with considerable success. Records were established with this machine. Duration, 63 minutes. Altitude, 515 feet. Distance, 27.5 miles, at a speed of 62 miles an hour. Breguet used what is today known as cyclic pitch control. This means that the angle at which a rotor blade meets the air is altered as the blade rotates with the hub. By photographing blades in slow motion, they can be seen to rise and fall with the influence of the airflow and centrifugal forces. When the aircraft is taking off, the pilot holds the stick roughly central, and the lift force is acting vertically. The pilot moves the stick forward. The advancing blade, furthest from the camera, decreases in pitch and flaps downwards. The retreating blade, nearest the camera, increases in pitch and flaps upwards. In effect, the rotor is tilted forward. It thus becomes the means of accelerating the aircraft forward, as well as the means of supporting it in the air. The nose tilts down in sympathy with the rotor. The pilot decides to turn to the right. Stick right. The blade on the left flaps up. The blade on the right flaps down. The aircraft goes into a right-hand turn. In 1937, the first really successful helicopter, the Fokker Achilles, was announced. The flexibility and control of this machine were demonstrated when Hanna Reitsch flew it inside the Berlin Sports Stadium. Then another of the pioneers, Igor Sikorsky, who had been working on helicopter design from the beginning of the century, achieved success in America. All these discoveries helped to produce the helicopter as we know it today. It's still curious to look at, but it can fly in a way even surpassing the flight of birds. It takes off and lands vertically, hovers in the air, and even turns a full circle over the same spot. Helicopter design is constantly progressing. The precision of control is something of which D'Ascanio could only have dreamed. The British Bristol 171, a single rotor type, carries 3 passengers as well as the pilot. In contrast to the sleek lines of the Bristol is the angular body of the largest helicopter yet built, the Air Horse. It's produced by the pioneer company started by the late Juan de la Cierva. The engine used in this helicopter is so powerful that the 3 rotors can lift a total weight of just over 8 tons. The Air Horse, with its enormous capacity, at last fills a gap between the usual helicopters with their limited loads and the aeroplane. At the other end of the scale, the Cierva company has produced a small sister to the Air Horse, a neat-looking 2-seater personal helicopter called the Skeeter. The Fairey company holds the world's helicopter speed record with the Gyrodyne, and here we see it on its record-breaking run at 124.3 miles an hour. The Gyrodyne uses an offset propeller instead of a tail rotor to counteract the torque reaction of the main rotor. This has the added advantage that the propeller gives additional thrust to drive the aircraft. In France, Louis Breguet is still one of the leaders of helicopter technique. He has been experimenting with a 3-seater design using superimposed contra-rotating rotors. A development of the pre-war German Fokker Achilles, keeping the original rotor configuration, has been made by Sud-Est and is designed to carry 6 people. Another French company, Sud-Ouest, have developed an experimental helicopter with a rotor driven by jets at the blade tips. These are fed with compressed air by an engine in the fuselage. One of the attractions of the jet-driven helicopter is that as the driving force is at the tips of the blades, there is no torque reaction to correct, and tail rotors and such devices aren't needed. Jet-driven rotors have also been developed in America. This experimental single-seater is built by the McDonnell Aircraft Corporation and is called Little Henry. The helicopter's types and designs are unending. The Sikorsky, now being built in England by Westlands, comes originally from America. It has been used for mail service experiments, landing in small fields during the day to pick up the village post, and by night, flying blind, carrying mail between two large towns. The same type of aircraft showed the possibility of intercity transport by flying from the roof of a London garage to the Place des Invalides in Paris. The Westland Sikorsky was also used in the first regular scheduled passenger service, flying between Cardiff and Liverpool. The American Bell helicopter is being used on the land with great success. Dusting orchards, spraying crops and cattle, the downwash from the rotors directs the insecticide over and under the leaves. The rotor downwash is also used for a strange form of harvesting. It's a simple way of gathering walnuts, which can't be damaged by their forceful descent. The Piasecki, or flying banana, an American military helicopter like something out of a story by Jules Verne or H.G. Wells. For emergency rescue from otherwise inaccessible places, the helicopter is unrivaled. It can transport the injured to a hospital or the stranded to safety. Whether the scene of the emergency is a jungle or a wrecked ship. In December 1946, Admiral Byrd took helicopters on his Antarctic expedition and used them for surveys more detailed than could be undertaken by a normal aeroplane and for getting to places no sledge could reach. The Hiller, with its Perspex bubble front, is a good example of a small helicopter with an all-round view. They can be useful for such things as police control of traffic and for surveying. The helicopter has provided new vantage points for the tourist. There is no better way of seeing the Grand Canyon, or of herding cattle or elk, than from the comfort of a helicopter with its large field of vision and its ability to fly slowly. Yes, the helicopter has arrived, slightly prehistoric to look at, but so versatile that it fills an important gap in transport. Rotary wing flight is now a reality. The helicopter was once part of a fantastic future in which you and I hope to fly about in our own private aircraft. Indeed, an Oxford College dean has used it to visit a convention. The helicopter has been used to do work that seemed impossible, carrying heavy materials high up into the Welsh mountains to repair the Croesor Dam. The helicopter will not supplant the car or the aeroplane, but it will enable us to fly with a freedom that we've never had before.
A young pilot, Charles Lester Morris, climbed into the seat of the world's first workable single-rotor helicopter, the Sikorsky VS-300. A new control system was about to be tested, a full cyclic pitch main rotor to control direction of flight, and a small vertical tail rotor to swing the helicopter on its axis, a control system still used in 90% of present-day helicopters. After a few seconds, it began to rock in the air, and Morris was forced to set it back down on the ground. For the helicopter's designer, Igor Sikorsky, the flight must have been a disappointment. But within a month, the VS-300 would be flying beautifully. Igor Sikorsky was born in Kiev, Russia in 1889. He grew up in a home full of books and conversation. He read works of Jules Verne about balloons and vertical flight machines, and listened to the fireside stories told by his mother. Legends of Icarus and Bucephalus. The legends of flight.
I think the legend of the helicopter goes back a very, very long way, because there's no doubt about it that man has dreamt of flying for hundreds of thousands of years, created legends of the flying carpets, the flying thrones, Pegasus, Bucephalus. All of these dreams, interestingly, had one thing in common. All of them were vertical takeoff and landing machines. None of these required a runway. And I think it was with dreams such as these that my father grew up, and that's where this lifelong love affair with a helicopter started.
It was said that Leonardo da Vinci experimented with air screws like that. A number of other people tried to build helicopters. I myself attempted to build two in 1909 and 1910.
These two crude helicopters were inspired by stories of the Wright brothers and a visit to Paris in 1909, where Sikorsky met and talked with some of the most famous French aviators of the day. But while Sikorsky's passion was for vertical flight, Russia at the time needed fixed-wing aircraft. Sikorsky became an airplane designer. His success was immediate. And then the power of his ambition began to show. He designed and built the world's first four-engine aircraft, and called it, appropriately, the Grand. He learned to fly and became his own test pilot. In 1917, the Russian Revolution came, and with it, the great emigration of white Russian refugees. Igor joined the flood. But New York in 1919 was by no means the promised land. Times were tough for refugees, and there were no opportunities for a white Russian aircraft designer. Ironically, it was a group of other white Russian immigrants who helped him.
It was a number of these white Russian refugees eventually, who of course had all heard or had known of my father's work in Russia, that convinced him to try again. And they all pooled their money, and it was with a very significant amount of $800 in cash that they started work in the backyard of a chicken farm just outside of Roosevelt Field on Long Island. These 12 or 14 Russians actually donated their labor. They worked for free and started the company. At a very critical point, just as they had it nearly completed, they ran out of money. And it was then that a very great Russian composer and concert pianist named Sergei Rachmaninoff came to the aid of this struggling company and gave at that time, the very significant sum of $5,000.
In the early 1930s, Sikorsky joined forces with transatlantic hero Charles Lindbergh. Lindbergh's energy was now directed at international travel, and the large Sikorsky flying boats were just right for exploring potential airline routes across the oceans of the world. There was no time for Sikorsky's first love, the helicopter.
While this is underway, it would not be wise to start something new, because it is not. Helicopter was not a project which I could just to charge to the engineers to do something about, and to test pilot to test and to do something about it also. It was a thing which called for attention, I would say love, I would say all energy, knowledge, and support which a man can put in.
Even so, the helicopter was never far from his mind. In 1931, he successfully patented a single rotor design. Young Sergei Sikorsky did what he could to help.
I was already growing up. I remember very, very clearly building small balsa wood models of these helicopters for my father's use in demonstrating them, first of all, to his own engineering people, many of whom, mind you, were very skeptical of the idea of abandoning the flying boat and getting into the helicopter.
But by late 1939, Igor Sikorsky had built and was attempting to fly the first crude form of his VS-300 helicopter.
You climb aboard this machine and you start up the engine and you try to fly it, never having flown a machine before in your life. So quite literally, at the age of 50, he went back and was retracing those same pioneering emotions that he had had at the age of 19, 20, and 21 when he built his own airplane without knowing how to build it, and then climbed aboard and tried to teach himself to fly while he was test flying this aircraft.
Igor Sikorsky was once again entering new territory.
In addition to all of this problem of literally walking out on very thin ice with a totally new and untested principle, was the very minor problem that Igor Sikorsky had never flown a helicopter before in his life. No one had. So first he had to teach himself to fly the machine.
The VS-300 had a cyclic pitch main rotor and a vertical tail rotor to control direction. But learning to fly it wasn't easy.
You had to lift the aircraft off the ground, teach yourself to hold it off the ground, say a foot or 2 or 3 feet off the ground, and then teach yourself how to be able to control the machine so that it stays within more or less 1 or 2 feet. That was the secret. Later, the challenge of slowly increasing forward flight called for another set of solutions, called for another set of redesigning of the main rotor head, called for nearly another year and a half of very hard, difficult work.
Part of this delay was caused by an incident on December 9, 1939. Serge Gluarev was the pilot. Stability and control were still very limited. A simple, unexpected gust of wind was too much to deal with. Serge Gluarev was not injured, but the VS-300 was, and Igor Sikorsky decided on another approach. He replaced the cyclic pitch control with 2 small horizontal rotors. Unequal pitch change on these rotors would roll the machine left or right. Equal pitch change would lift or drop the tail. It appeared to work quite well, and in March 1940, it was tested in flight. Sikorsky made many flights of 20 minutes or more and quickly learned to hover it or move it backwards or sideways, but the controls were still uncertain. The first public demonstration, with Igor Sikorsky as pilot, underlined a weakness of this control system. While a hover was reasonably controllable, in forward flight, downwash from the main rotor disturbed the rear rotors and caused instability. Controlling the machine was very difficult, and often a quick return to the Earth was the only safe course.
I remember one of my father's closest friends and cohorts on the helicopter project, also a white Russian refugee with a rather intriguing accent, saying, "It was very interesting time. It was time of educated guess and crystal ball." And that's the way the helicopter was designed.
Igor Sikorsky now set out to analyze and cure the forward flight problem. On October 9, 1940, after weeks of test flights, he was making a series of forward runs about 20 feet above the ground when one of the rear pylons snapped away. The VS-300 crashed again. Igor, unhurt, stood for a long moment looking at the wreckage. Then he said, "I think I'll get her home now."
You really never knew whether it was the machine, whether the design was at fault or the test pilot was at fault. But I remember Dad with a grin in his eye saying, since both responsibilities were concentrated in one person, namely myself, I couldn't put the blame on anyone else. And I had to accept it, repair the machine, and carry on.
He did, and he got on with the task of refining the design and making it work. The pylons were swept back, and the tips raised to get them out of the downwash. The torque rotor was also raised on its own new pylon. In April 1941, Igor tackled the world helicopter endurance record with the VS-300 in this configuration. Igor Sikorsky's new world record was 1 hour, 32 minutes, and 26 seconds. Tests continued on this modified T-bone layout. Forward flight was now possible, and its controllability was greatly extended. Earlier in 1941, the Army Air Corps had been impressed enough with the helicopter to order a two-place version, with this control system to be called the XR-4. The encouraging performance of the VS-300 brought Igor Sikorsky closer to a long-held dream: to build a vehicle that could go anywhere, regardless of terrain, and set itself down in confined spaces on land or water, something that would give, in Igor Sikorsky's words, unlimited freedom of transportation. At the time, the helicopter's potential to do things no airplane could do was not always obvious.
I remember a good friend of mine and a very prominent designer, scientist and aviation asked, when would the helicopter go faster than the airplane? Do you know that? I said, yes, I know. The answer is never. When would the helicopter be more efficient than the airplane? Do you know that? I also said, yes, I know that. Never. But I said that helicopter will do a number of jobs which no airplane will do, and which in fact nothing else will do except a helicopter.
Charles Lester Morris made his first flight in the VS-300 in May 1941. Because of the difficulty of forward flight, he spent most of his time learning to hover and move backwards and sideways. In 1987, Les Morris spoke about those pioneering days and the need for Sikorsky to make major changes if the VS-300 was to be truly flyable.
So early in the summer of 1941, the decision was made to return to cyclic pitch control in the VS-300 helicopter. It would be so much simpler than having those awkward and cumbersome tail rotor outriggers. We would try to do it in two stages. First, we would get rid of the outriggers, of course. Then we would use cyclic pitch control just to the lateral control of the machine, rolling it left and right. And for longitudinal control, we would use a single horizontal tail rotor mounted on a tower high above the tail, well out of the downwash air from the main rotor. In early August, we rolled the machine out with this new arrangement, and there were a lot of adjustments and changes to be made. But on August 14th, 1941, remember that date, we suddenly discovered in one day that we had a completely flyable helicopter, all in one day.
Les Morris's first flight with the new control layout was a revelation. He was able to do forward runs of 70 miles an hour, quick stops, backup, and do things they'd only dreamed of with the old system, and no problems developed. Even so, Igor Sikorsky decided that this was not the right control system for the new Army helicopter, the Sikorsky XR-4, and since the VS-300 was the test vehicle, it would be modified to test the next stage of control development.
So the beautiful, flyable little VS-300 was once again torn apart. The tail tower was removed, and the rotor hub was realigned for full cyclic pitch control. On December 8, 1941, the day that the United States declared herself at war with Japan, we rolled the ship out for the first trial.
After the elation of his previous flights in the VS-300, Les Morris's first experience with the cyclic pitch version was a disappointment. This flight introduced doubts into the minds of the whole team, and they had to back off the test program to analyze the situation. What was wrong? Was it part of the rotor system, or was it something to do with the whole design? Some months earlier, the oil dampeners, or oleostruts, had been removed from the rotor blades, and as it turned out, that was the problem.
The old oleostruts were recalled to active service, but they were installed at the rotor hub in such a way that they would damp the blades in the horizontal plane. Like a miracle from the Dark Ages, they turned the trick. Flights were made forward, backward, and sideward, and no wobble or resonance was detected. Thus, on the last day of 1941, the VS-300 demonstrated another completely satisfactory control system.
At last, they had it right. The classic Sikorsky configuration had arrived. A single main rotor with full cyclic control, and a small vertical anti-torque rotor with variable pitch. Sikorsky's dream of unlimited freedom of transportation was within reach, but he also saw the helicopter as a means of saving lives. Now, with control problems apparently solved, there was no limit to what might be achieved. Igor Sikorsky had indeed taken the chance to live his life over again. For the second time, he had built a flying machine without knowing how, and had taught himself to fly it. This was the final version of the VS-300, the culmination of 3.5 years of development. The name was still the same, but not much else was.
Probably, having lived through much of the development of the S-300, I can say with some minor confidence that the only pieces of the helicopter that are identical to that first machine that lifted off in September 1939 are the pilot's seat and certain of the structure around the engine. I would dare say everything else was bent, broken, smashed, or modified during the 3.5 years of the helicopter's existence.
And now, the race was on to educate the public and decision-makers about the virtues of the helicopter. Demonstrations of extreme controllability were the order of the day. The wide-open spaces were out. The trick now was to land in the smallest area you could fit. The VS-300 successor, the XR-4, was formally accepted by the Army on May 30, 1942, and went into production as the R-4. As it demonstrates here, even with the power off and auto-rotation, it could come very close to landing on a handkerchief. Igor Sikorsky's helicopters had already begun to change the face of aviation, and he had achieved what the cynics had said was impossible.
Any responsible engineer could prove to you that the single main lifting rotor, and then to steal power from that rotor to drive a small little rudder-type rotor, is improper and inefficient. And yet Igor Sikorsky felt that was the logical way to go. And it's interesting that today, this configuration that was so criticized when he first applied it is the dominant configuration. And in fact, roughly 95% of all of the helicopters in the world built since World War II are built with this same configuration.
Igor Sikorsky died in 1972. He saw 30 vibrant years of helicopter development, and for those years saw how his pioneering work came to change the face of 20th century life. But the helicopter was not his only passion. Like his Renaissance forerunner, Leonardo da Vinci, his interests were wide-ranging, and he was very good at a great many things.
The further away he gets, the more we realize what a great and unique person he was. Not only as an aeronautical engineer, not only as a very, very gifted test pilot, but also as a philosopher, as a historian, as an amateur astronomer, also as a very brilliant archaeologist and historian. I think he could have been a very, very great success in a great many professions. We're just lucky that he chose aviation as his first love.
He was a Russian by birth. He fled the motherland one step ahead of a Bolshevik firing squad. He designed and built the first four-engine airplane, the first airplane with an enclosed cockpit, and together with Charles Lindbergh, cooked up the seaplanes that made international airlines practical. Lindbergh called him the greatest aviation engineer he'd ever met.
He showed tremendous scientific talent at a very early age. By the time he was 11 or 12, he had read how to build small electrical motors, but he couldn't find any in Kiev at that time, so he actually began to take the bobbins from his mother's sewing machine and wrap them with wire, and he created his own electrical motors that he then powered with batteries by taking pickle jars and making batteries out of them.
For all his fixed-wing achievements, however, he is most closely identified with helicopters. For it was the helicopter company he founded relatively late in his life that turned his name into a household word. He is Igor Sikorsky, and he is a legend of air power. Igor Ivanovich Sikorsky was born May 25, 1889, in Kiev, Russia. His father was a psychology professor and his mother a doctor, and together they nurtured their son's early interest in science.
His life was in a home in which he felt very sheltered, very secure, very happy, in a home in which his father encouraged scientific research and encouraged daydreaming. He read what today we call science fiction books, primarily Jules Verne. He loved Jules Verne, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, 80 Days Around the World, A Voyage to the Moon. But primarily, there was one book, Robur the Conqueror, also known as, prophetically, The Clipper of the Clouds. And it's not too well known here in America, but it's a book that describes a flying machine very accurately, actually a helicopter. Very, very accurately describes a helicopter, some obviously 40, 50 years before it was ever flown.
He attended the Petrograd Naval College, but left in 1906 to study engineering in Paris, then the center of aviation in Europe. His time in France was a revelation. The Wright brothers were demonstrating their flyer outside Paris. The sky seemed filled with airships, and everywhere there were aeronauts and engineers collaborating on bigger and better flying machines. He returned to Russia and enrolled at the Mechanical Engineering College of the Kiev Polytechnical Institute.
He started pestering his parents to send him to Paris, because that was where the Wright brothers were flying. That's where immediately after the Wright brothers' success, the Europeans tweaked their airplanes a little bit so as to pick up a little bit of the know-how that the Wrights had demonstrated, and flying exploded in France.
In 1909, armed with an engineering degree, he returned to Paris. He befriended the elite of aviation there and spent much of his time talking about his vision of an aircraft that could take off vertically, hover, move sideways, and set itself safely back down. The experienced pilots around him laughed at his plans. It was hard enough then getting an airplane to simply fly. Getting it to stand still without falling out of the air seemed laughable. Sikorsky announced to his doubting friends that he would return to Kiev and build a rotary wing aircraft, a helicopter. He bought two engines, 15 and 25 horsepower, and boarded a train east.
It's significant to me that his first aircraft and his second aircraft were both helicopters. They didn't fly. We know now that 15 and 25 horsepower is just too little to do it. But these were the first two aircraft he attempted. Very wisely, he then decided that he had to, in his words, temporarily postpone the helicopter.
He built a succession of small planes that clearly owe much of their inspiration to the Wright brothers. In only a few years, Sikorsky was one of the leading engineers in Russia. He was put in charge of the aviation subsidiary of the Baltic Railroad Car Works and went to work designing and building aircraft for the Tsar.
He was the first, actually, to come up with the idea of using multiple engines on an airplane. After he had one engine get caught with mosquitoes in the carburetor and the airplane went down, he realized that two engines are better than one.
A multi-engine airplane was a radical idea. Other engineers thought it impossible. If the weight of the engines didn't keep the plane on the ground, they believed the forces and vibration of more than one engine would tear the plane apart in the sky.
During his early years, he developed multiple engine aircraft, four-engine aircraft that were very, very large, which requires a great deal of skill as an engineer to be able to produce a large aircraft that everything works correctly, especially at the time of the type of materials they had to work with. It was quite an achievement.
Sikorsky continued on, however, and the result was a four-engine behemoth with an almost unfathomable 89-foot wingspan. Called simply the Grand, when it flew in 1913, it made Sikorsky into a Russian hero.
The Grand was a unique experiment in trying to convince the world that a large four-engine aircraft was possible. He wanted to build this airplane because he wanted to prove that an aircraft had to have two characteristics. The Grand was designed to demonstrate two critical elements. A, the element of being able to maintain altitude and continue flight if one engine failed on you. And the second, equally important element, that airplane had to be able to lose any one of its engines, inboard, outboard, any one side or the other, and remain controllable. He, with a twinkle in his eye, would talk about the Grand and say that it was a very unique aircraft. It took off at 65 kilometers an hour, it cruised at 65 kilometers an hour, and it stalled at 65 kilometers an hour. But other than that, it was a highly efficient airplane.
His next plane, the Ilya Muromets, was even bigger and became the main bomber of the Russian Imperial Air Force in World War I. Designing aircraft had made Sikorsky wealthy. He was invited to meet several times with the Tsar, and there was talk that he might be knighted for his work.
When the revolution started, that very fact that he had been recognized by the Tsar and had been rewarded by the Tsar made him an enemy of the working class and made him a target of the Soviet, or the Bolshevik at that time, hit squads.
A committed individualist, Sikorsky could not live under communism and decided to leave. His wife chose to stay and refused to let their daughter travel with him. He left penniless and broken-hearted, a refugee bound for Paris, but destined for the United States. After fleeing the Russian Revolution, Igor Sikorsky tried to find work in Paris.
The World War I was still on in 1917, and so he went to France, where the French aviation authorities knew him very well, because that he had purchased during the war a large number of French as well as British engines for his 400 bombers. They commissioned him to build a large bomber for them.
But when World War I ended, so did the French commitment to aviation. And with no other option, he sailed for the United States.
My father then spent some weeks studying the situation and then decided that he would go to the United States, because he felt that this very, in his words, this very great and wonderful country was probably the only nation which would accept a penniless immigrant with the dream to start building airplanes again.
Though famous in his own country, he was unknown in the United States. He arrived in an unwelcome wave of refugees. There were no opportunities for him in aviation. With World War I ended, no one was building new aircraft. The glut of military surplus biplanes supplied the embryonic commercial aviation business with all the planes it could handle. With nothing else to do, Sikorsky tutored Russian immigrants on New York's Lower East Side. He lectured on math and astronomy and aviation. He lived in poverty, but never let it break his spirit. And as time passed, he built up a following in the large community of Russian refugees. His optimism seemed boundless, and his vision of the amazing future of flight made what were really little more than daydreams seem real.
For a lot of the Russian immigrants, he was something of a hero, something to aspire to, having come here as an immigrant and having all these dreams that he was so anxious to fulfill.
In the early 1920s, Sikorsky resigned himself to the fact that he would never again get to design and build aircraft. Then, in 1923, a group of Russian émigrés approached Sikorsky. They had a small amount of money and were willing to work. Would Sikorsky do them the honor of helping them design and build an airplane? Sikorsky set up operations on a chicken farm next to Roosevelt Airport on Long Island. There, he and his small band of Russian immigrants went to work. There was never enough money for payroll and barely enough for materials. No matter, Sikorsky and his Russians worked through night after night on a large twin-engine airplane Sikorsky had designed. And then, with the plane partially built and a desperate need for high-powered engines to make it fly, Sikorsky and his Russians ran out of money. It seemed as if their dream of flight was going to die.
A gentleman drove up, stepped out of his chauffeur-driven limousine, walked around inspecting the airplane, which was being built in the open. The gentleman stopped, started a conversation with Igor Sikorsky, and Igor Sikorsky eventually tells the story that this gentleman sat down and wrote out a check for $5,000, handed it to my father and said, "I believe in you, I trust you, pay me back when you can, go, start building your airplanes." The man's name was Sergei Rachmaninoff, And it was this great pianist and composer who gave Dad his start in America.
The plane Rachmaninoff's contribution made possible was the S-29A, a twin-engine, all-metal transport that was the forerunner of the modern airliner.
It gave him the intellectual freedom and the financial wherewithal to produce the aircraft that a visionary could see, and in the process produce very successful aircraft.
He followed with other designs and started building a reputation as a visionary. In 1930, he gave a newspaper interview in which he described a glimmering future of sleek metal aircraft carrying hundreds of passengers from continent to continent.
Igor Sikorsky predicted in this newspaper interview that New York would be the center and the hub of one of the most busy airline services. Giant all-metal airplanes, sleek all-metal airplanes carrying hundreds of passengers would be taking off every hour on the hour for the far corners of the world.
At a time when most aircraft were still made of fabric stretched over a wooden frame, he talked about pressurized cabins and jet engines as if they were something he had already tested.
To get metaphysical, my father also believed very strongly in intuition, in a sixth sense, which sometimes came to you in a flash in the middle of the night. Sometimes it arrived very, very slowly after you'd been chewing on a problem for a while.
He had his first big hit with the S-38, a flying boat that Pan American Airways used to open new commercial aviation routes to Central and South America. That success brought in other investors, including United Aviation, which was then a major producer of aircraft. And for the first time since leaving Russia, Sikorsky had the money for large-scale design and construction of aircraft. Though still fascinated with helicopters, his business grew because of his success designing fixed-wing aircraft. Among those who visited the Sikorsky factory was Charles Lindbergh, just returned from his flight to Paris. Sikorsky and Lindbergh found in each other kindred spirits. They were both intellectually restless, at the same time cerebral and instinctive. Both had clear visions of aviation as an everyday experience, pioneers who longed to make their field of endeavor commonplace to the point of being boring. Even their differences seemed complementary. Lindbergh looked at aviation from the point of view of a pilot. He wanted to open the world to aviation, and he traveled ceaselessly, charting routes for others to follow. Sikorsky, on the other hand, saw aviation as an engineering problem. To follow the routes Lindbergh was plotting, a passenger plane would have to have a certain range, be able to reach a certain altitude, and carry a certain amount of fuel.
He'd spent a lot of time in the dark listening to music, thinking, and he felt that he could almost see into the future, so to speak. Again, he was a very mystical, very spiritual man, to see what the needs would be, where his ideas could be applied to the betterment of mankind. And I think his particular genius came in his ability to take technology and apply it to the human need.
Lindbergh, Sikorsky believed, was the greatest pilot in the world. Sikorsky, Lindbergh said, was the most gifted aircraft designer he had ever met.
Dad had a great deal of respect for Lindbergh because there's no doubt about it, man knew a great deal about aviation. And in fact, it was this gentle teamwork between Lindbergh and Sikorsky, the mutual respect that they had for each other, that was absolutely wonderful to see in action.
The first plane they collaborated on was the S-40, a flying boat larger and more dependable than any other. Lindbergh was working for Pan American Airways, setting up airmail service to the Caribbean, which was then a sea of islands without landing strips. Tying them together with aircraft posed problems that seemed even to Lindbergh nearly insoluble.
I was growing up at that time. I was a small kid, but I was privileged once in a while to sit in a corner of the dining room when these two giants would discuss the growth of aviation, the need for higher speeds, the inevitability of higher wing loadings, and yet the improvement of our knowledge of aerodynamics, which would still keep landing speeds down while the cruising speeds would go up. Now, it was a wonderful way to grow up, because you may have gotten a formal education in high school and in college, but if you were an aviation buff, as I was, those evenings listening to Charles Lindbergh and Igor Sikorsky were the greatest aeronautical academy that anybody could dream of having.
It was the beginning of one of his most productive periods. Working together with Pan Am and Lindbergh, he designed a series of amphibious aircraft that formed the famed Pan Am Clipper fleet. He had in his career played a key role in two separate revolutions. In Russia, he had pioneered multi-engine aircraft, which became the first dependable air transports and long-range bombers. In the United States, he had designed the flying boats that had made intercontinental air travel possible. The Pan Am Clippers shrank the world, putting every place in the world within a couple of days' travel of every place else. So, with his company doing well and his reputation secure, he returned to his first love. In the middle 1930s, Igor Sikorsky dug out 30 years of notes and sketches, dusted off a handful of patents, and went to work on the helicopter. Before Igor Sikorsky got seriously into helicopter development, there had been a number of more or less successful experiments in vertical flight. Some could fly but not hover, and others couldn't fly at all. Overcoming the torque of a spinning main rotor and still being able to maneuver was such a big problem that it led many to believe that a practical helicopter would never be developed. Sikorsky, however, believed passionately that the helicopter would work.
He was not interested just in engineering and technology. The primary reason he developed with the helicopter was to rescue people, to save people's lives.
As he worked and reworked the design of his helicopter, Sikorsky said over and over that if a person was in danger, an airplane could fly over and throw flowers to him, but a helicopter could come in and perform a rescue. Working at his Stratford, Connecticut factory, he and his team, still made up largely of Russian immigrants, built the VS-300. Ungainly by modern standards, the 300 was little more than a framework to support the engine and rotor. On September 14, 1939, Sikorsky sat down in the VS-300's pilot seat for its first flight.
When he climbed into this machine for the first time, he said it was a beautiful chance to relive one's life all over again, to design a new type of flying machine without quite knowing how to design it, build it without quite knowing how to build it, and then you climbed aboard and you opened up the throttle and you tried to teach yourself to fly at the same time that you were the test pilot in charge of the helicopter.
Sikorsky carefully, slowly lifted off, learning to fly the helicopter as it rose. He went only a few feet off the ground, hesitated a few seconds in midair, and settled gently back to Earth. The world had its first working, practical helicopter. While Sikorsky thought the helicopter's future lay in rescue, the first American military man to get a look at the VS-300 instantly recognized its battlefield potential.
People began to realize the idea that we can move large numbers of troops, we can attach weapons to these, and so the United States Army, for example, their aircraft, their helicopters, these are very, very important for maneuver of the Army units.
In 1942, while looking for aircraft that could be developed to fight German U-boats in the North Atlantic, two Coast Guard officers paid Sikorsky a visit. They watched in awe as Sikorsky lifted 25 feet off the ground, lifting a second man below on a suspended rope ladder. In their report on the test, they said Sikorsky's machine had many advantages over the blimps the Navy had developed for anti-submarine warfare. They recommended the Coast Guard buy 3 or 4 for testing, but the Navy balked at the $250,000 price tag. When the officers pointed out that helicopters could serve a search and rescue function, the War Department replied that the Navy was not interested in life-saving. They just wanted to get on with the business of killing the enemy.
I think he was aware that inevitably, sometime sooner or later, it would be used as a military instrument of war. But that he said, was not the fault of the helicopter, because for every single person that it killed, he insisted quite logically that it probably saved 100.
For the remainder of his life, Sikorsky designed and built helicopters. From the R-4, the first mass-produced helicopter, to the UH-60 Blackhawk, the machines he and his company designed and built rewrote the rules of aviation, of warfare, and of search and rescue.
Whenever one talks about Igor Sikorsky today, it is the helicopter that he is remembered as. And that's, I think, justifiably so. It is the last and, in many respects, the most important piece of equipment that my father invented and left for mankind. When I asked him about it, he said that he had a number of favorite aircraft. And obviously the Grand, the first prototype four-engine aircraft, was one. The flying boats were another one. But I believe also he himself felt proudest of his achievements in designing the helicopter.